A gray mist clung to the early morning light over King's Landing. Though the sun had begun its climb behind the narrow band of clouds, its warmth felt distant, as though uncertain whether to break through the gloom. Along the streets, where rubble from battle still littered corners and alleys, a few survivors picked through stones and ashes, hoping to salvage a meager meal or a fragment of something valuable. In some places, the air still smelled faintly of smoke, though the worst of the flames had been extinguished weeks ago. Yet for all its ruin, the city was alive with murmurs of a new day, a new beginning. Guards stood at intervals with the stark sigil upon their cloaks, and passers-by cast them long, questioning looks. Jon Snow was in the Red Keep, but he no longer sat upon the Iron Throne. He had ordered that monstrous seat of power melted down. Its jagged swords and twisted metal were gone, no more than a pile of slag and memory. Some said it was an insult to the legacy of the Targaryens. Some said it was the dawn of something better. In truth, Jon himself did not much care what rumors people spun. He only knew that he had seen the horrors wrought when men and women lusted for that seat, and he wanted no part of it. So, the Iron Throne was banned. No new blacksmith would forge a replacement. Let it remain a ghost in the city's mind. He had no wish to inspire the same thirst for conquest that had claimed so many lives. In the courtyard of the Red Keep, the old stable walls bore black scorch marks from the dragon's onslaught. Jon paced there in the hush of morning, listening to the soft scuff of his boots against loose pebbles. A light wind from Blackwater Bay occasionally lifted his dark curls, carrying the salty tang of the sea. He was Lord of the Seven Kingdoms. He, the one who had never wanted power. After the madness, he had borne so many regrets that the act of breathing sometimes felt like punishment. Yet the realm had to be led, and few seemed willing to trust any hand but his. So, he had accepted. A reluctant king, yet a king nonetheless. He had refused to call himself king, though. That word was steeped in a history he found distasteful. Lord of the Seven Kingdoms was the compromise. It signified a shepherd more than a tyrant, someone to guide and defend rather than command and subjugate. It would take time for people to grow accustomed to it, but the realm had endured changes before. If melting down the Iron Throne was a symbol, then perhaps refusing that old title of king would be another. His advisors insisted he hold court, even without a throne. The people needed to see him, needed to speak their pleas, their worries. So, he had taken to the Great Hall, where the Iron Throne once loomed at the far end. Now, there was only a broad dais, empty and unadorned. Jon stood or sat on a simple wooden chair when hearing petitions, an arrangement that unsettled some lords who expected more grandeur. The small folk, however, seemed curious and even hopeful. They bowed, but they did not tremble. The first weeks had passed in a fever of challenges. Rebuilding was slow, resources were limited. A new council had formed under him, composed of those he trusted, and those whom he was compelled to include for the sake of stability. Tyrion Lannister served as his hand, though the man's face was lined with more weariness than ever before. Ser Davos, wise and steady, counseled him on matters of trade and shipping. Bran Stark, distant and inscrutable, served as the realm's memory. Though he refused official positions, he remained a voice Jon trusted above most others. But each day seemed to bring another piece of the old tension. The Lord of Storm's End might be vexed that a Targaryen, even if half, held so much power. The Lady of the Arbor demanded restitution for lost vineyards. The new Prince of Dorne, coaxed out of neutral desert lands, insisted on certain freedoms if he were to bend the knee. And on and on. Jon had grown accustomed to tension long ago, but the weight of constant decisions pressed heavily on him. There was no respite, though every morning he might wish to slip away, saddle a horse, and ride north until the wall once again stretched before him. Yet he knew it would not do to abandon them now. He had been chosen. Whether by some concept of birthright or by the will of the people, he carried the burden. And so he remained. Each day he rose early, shaped his plan for rebuilding, then welcomed dignitaries, listened to problems, and gave what solutions he could. Each evening he trudged to bed or took a walk along the battered ramparts, trying to quiet the royal in his mind. It was a lonely existence, despite the bustle of a court around him. On this morning, he paused in his pacing and turned his gaze upward. Dawn was tinted with subtle pink and orange clouds. His memory wandered back to Castle Black, to the crisp air of the north where he had once stood watch. It felt like years had passed, lifetimes even, though it had not been so long. As a boy, he had yearned for acceptance, or a sense of belonging. Then the Great War had swallowed him, and everything changed. Now he stood in a city he'd never loved, under a sky that felt foreign, grappling with a destiny that had been thrust upon him. He breathed in the ocean air once more before making for the council chambers. A handful of guards fell in step behind him. He tried not to resent their presence. They were there to protect him after all, but it often felt like captivity. Still, there were more pressing things to consider. Each day was a puzzle, and the pieces were rarely neat or merciful. He reached the corridor leading to the council room. Doors of oak and iron were propped open, letting in the faint light. As he crossed the threshold, he found Tyrion already seated at the large round table that had replaced the old rectangular one. Jon wanted no head of the table. He wanted no illusions that any single person was above the others. Tyrion looked up from a few sheaves of parchment, eyes rimmed with a fatigue that mirrored Jon's own. "Good morning," Jon said softly. Tyrion grunted, rubbing his eyes. "As good as it can be, I suppose. We've had ravens from the Reach and the Vale. Updates on harvest projections, taxes, and a few other interesting matters. Messerman." Jon pulled out a chair and settled into it without ceremony. "Interesting how?" Tyrion's mouth twisted in a half-smile that lacked humor. "It seems the Vale is hesitant about the entire concept of a Lord of the Seven Kingdoms. They want a formal coronation, or at least a ceremony that can seal your legitimacy. They fear a new round of conflicts, if it looks like your rule is purely, well, rumor and goodwill. They want pomp, traditions, beasts, all the rest." "Bernice." Jon exhaled and tilted his head back, closing his eyes for a moment. He had anticipated as much. It was not surprising that the Vale, ever cautious, would push for formality. Are we in a position to hold a coronation with half the city still in ruins? People in Flea Bottom haven't even got enough bread. Tyrion shrugged. "That's what I told them. Yet they believe if we don't move swiftly, powerful figures might see your refusal as a sign of weakness, or a signal that you don't truly intend to rule as a unifying power. They worry about uprisings, and, well, as you know, the realm is hardly stable." "Not so." Jon leaned forward, elbows on the table. "What do you think?" "I think we must walk a fine line," Tyrion admitted. "Perhaps you can hold a modest ceremony. Something to show the lords and ladies that you've accepted your role, but not a lavish spectacle when half the city starves. There must be a middle ground." Jon nodded, though he did not reply right away. In his mind, he envisioned a muted affair, perhaps in the Red Keep's courtyard or along the city walls, acknowledging the realm's suffering while still giving the nobles their tradition. "We'll consider it. Thank you, Tyrion." Ser Davos entered just then, followed by a handful of other council members. They exchanged brief greetings, their expressions taut with the kind of tension that had grown all too familiar. Jon watched them gather around the round table, each taking their seat. The chatter of half a dozen conversations mingled until Jon raised a hand. Quiet fell. Reports came first. The damage to the harbor, which was slowly being repaired. The concerns of local merchants about new taxes for reconstruction. The pressing need for more farmland to feed the battered city. Tyrion laid out budgets. Davos discussed the shipping routes. All the while Jon listened, occasionally offering a question or a directive, but mostly letting those more experienced in these matters give their input. Leadership, he had learned, was as much about listening as it was about declaring. After some time, the conversation turned to a matter that had been troubling the outskirts of King's Landing, an influx of refugees from the Riverlands who had lost their homes. The tension rose as the council weighed the best approach to care for these displaced people without draining the city's own scarce resources. Jon clenched his jaw, recalling his time as Lord Commander, when feeding the wildlings tested the supply lines of the Night's Watch. Still, They had found a way. That was what you did for people who needed shelter. You found a way. The discussion stretched on. Servants quietly refilled cups with watered wine, and the council members grew restless. Jon realized hours had passed when a faint rumble in his stomach reminded him he'd skipped the morning meal. He noticed Tyrion tapping his quill against the parchment, an absent-minded gesture that betrayed the man's impatience. At length, Jon announced, "We'll expand the temporary encampments outside the main gates. Provide them with tents, cots if we can manage, and enough food to survive. It won't be comfortable, but it will keep them alive. Tyrion, see to the supply lines. Davos, speak with the port masters and see if any shipments can be rerouted to fill the gap. I won't have them starving at our walls." No. They made notes, nodded, and then talk turned to lesser but still urgent matters. A rumored group of bandits near Rosby, friction among lords in the Westerlands, about who would inherit certain titles after the near destruction of House Lannister, and so on. By the time the meeting ended, the sun stood high in the sky, streaming through the open windows, with a warmth that felt incongruous to the heavy atmosphere in the room. Jon dismissed the council and remained seated as they filed out. Quiet settled, except for the distant clang of smiths laboring in the city. The space, newly stripped of the old regime's fineries, felt oddly comforting in its sparseness. With a small sigh, he pushed himself to his feet and ventured into the hall. He found Ghost waiting for him near the entry corridor. The direwolf's eyes glowed red in the half-light, and his presence was a reminder of the north, of home. Jon reached down to scratch the thick white fur of Ghost's neck, a fleeting smile touching his lips. At least he had this companion by his side. The wolf followed him as he made his way to a quiet chamber, where the sounds of the city were muffled by heavy walls. He stepped inside, closed the door gently, and leaned against it, inhaling the silence. But the silence was not to last. A soft knock intruded, and when Jon opened the door, there stood Arya Stark. She had a small smile at the corner of her mouth, though her eyes were watchful. She slipped inside, closing the door behind her. Ghost let out a low, friendly rumble of greeting. Arya had come south a few weeks after the final battles, her curiosity piqued by the fact that Jon was now a ruler, albeit a reluctant one. She said she wanted to see the world, but she'd made a stop in King's Landing to make sure her brother was managing, or so Jon suspected. Arya had grown over the years into a quiet, intense presence. She had gained skill beyond measure with a blade and a kind of fierce independence. Even now, her hand rested casually near the hilt of a slender dagger at her belt. "How was your day?" she asked softly, raising an eyebrow. Jon let out a short laugh. "Long and dawn. And it's not even midday." "Dandiwani." Arya glanced around the austere chamber, taking in the plain furniture. A simple bench along one wall, a small wooden table near the window. "Still don't want the throne, do you?" He shook his head. "No. I don't want any of it, truly. But this is what's needed." She nodded, walking to the window to peer out over the ruined cityscape. Smoke rose in thin coils from a few areas still under reconstruction. "I heard rumors that a few lords aren't happy there's no throne for them to kneel in front of. They say it's improper." "They?" Jon joined her at the window, folding his arms across his chest. "Perhaps it is. Or perhaps it's time they learned something new." He closed his eyes for a moment. "We need to change how things work here. Power shouldn't be something we chase like dogs chasing a bone. Too many have died for that." Arya's voice came quieter, laced with memories. "Yes, we've seen too much of that." They stood in companionable silence for a moment, each lost in separate reflections. Eventually, Jon turned and retrieved a small flask from a drawer near the table. He took a single swig, feeling the warmth of strong spirits spread through him, and offered it to Arya. She accepted, took a brief sip, and handed it back. No words were needed. Before they could speak again, another knock sounded. 3 quick raps that announced someone with urgent business. With a subtle roll of her eyes, Arya moved aside, letting Jon go to the door. Outside stood a young steward, breathless and obviously flustered. "Lord Snow," the steward said, stumbling a bit over how to address Jon. Most people hadn't settled on what to call him in place of Your Grace. You're needed in the courtyard. A group of Riverland refugees arrived and... Well, there's a bit of a commotion. John frowned. Commotion? Yes, my lord. They're refusing to set up in the temporary camps. They insist on seeing you personally, claiming you owe them. John glanced at Arya, whose brows lifted. Then he nodded to the steward. Show me. With a few swift strides, John and Arya followed the steward. Ghost padded behind them, silent as a shadow. As they made their way to the courtyard, echoes of raised voices bounced off the stone walls. A cluster of new arrivals, mostly men and women in ragged clothing, stood near the gates, flanked by stark guards. Several children clung to their parents, wide-eyed, anxious. John could see the fear and anger in their postures. When John stepped into the open space, one of the refugees, a tall, gaunt man with a sunken gaze, pushed forward. A guard grabbed at him, but John raised a hand, signaling them to stand down. He stepped closer, keeping his voice calm. What's the problem here? The man's eyes flickered with desperate fury. We lost everything, he said, voice trembling but loud enough for the courtyard to hear. Lady and her knights burned our village. We had to flee. Some of us wanted to go north, but we heard you, Jon Snow, had become lord. That you helped the free folk once. We came here because we believed you'd do the same for us. Jon's chest tightened, remembering the day he flung open the gates of the wall for the wildlings. So many battles, so many choices made, each with consequences. You're welcome here. We're setting up safe places for you outside the city. We'll help provide what we can. The city's been through. The man shook his head fiercely. No, we won't live in scraps. You promised to be different than the others who sat on that cursed chair. But we see your guards with their new cloaks, and we're told we can camp outside the walls like animals. Why not open the city proper to us? The Red Keep has courtyards big enough to shelter us. Murmurs rose among the crowd. A few nodded in agreement, but some only shifted uncertainly. Jon opened his mouth to respond, uncertain how to soothe their anger. But Arya unexpectedly spoke up behind him. This city is in ruins, she said, stepping forward. We can't cram everyone inside the walls until the structures are rebuilt. It's not that you're unwelcome. It's that there's hardly a roof that won't leak or collapse in here. You'd be in as much danger inside as out. The tall man met Arya's gaze, wariness mixing with anger. You say that, but how can we trust you? Everyone wants to keep the poor out. It's always the same. Jon lifted a hand, gently gesturing for Arya to let him handle it. I understand your fear, he said, voice steady. We've all suffered losses. We all want safety. But the city can't hold so many, not yet. Let me provide resources outside the walls, on higher ground, away from the burned-out buildings and unstable rubble. We can build proper shelter soon, but it must be done step by step. An older woman with wispy white hair and eyes as sharp as flint stepped up, leaning on a gnarled cane. She regarded Jon for a moment, then asked, What about farmland? Some of us know how to work the soil, but we've nowhere to do it. That? Jon considered that. The crown lands did include broad fields, though many were wrecked or scorched. If you're willing, we can allocate sections of land north of the Rosby Road. The soil there hasn't been completely ruined. We'll need to coordinate, but if you help tend those fields, the harvest can benefit you. And the city. It was a plan that Davos had floated during the council meetings, though they had not yet put it into action. The old woman narrowed her eyes, as though testing the sincerity of his words. And we'll be safe, out in the open? Bandits prowl those roads. I'll dispatch patrols, Jon said. The new watch will keep it as safe as anywhere can be in these times. You have my word. Tall man glanced at the others. Their expressions ranged from caution to reluctant hope. Finally he nodded, though his gaze didn't soften. We'll hold you to that, he muttered. Jon gave a curt nod in return. See the steward. He'll note down how many of you can work the fields, how many need medical attention, and see that you get provisions. A few in the group dipped their heads or murmured thanks, while others silently turned away, their distrust still palpable. The guards moved aside, letting them pass toward a side gate where the stewards kept records. Jon stood there a moment, heart heavy. He felt Arya's presence at his shoulder. Nothing was easy in this realm. Even extending aid could spark resentment. "They'll see your sincerity in time," Arya said quietly. Jon nodded, but he wasn't entirely sure. Even so, he had to keep trying. He cast a final glance at the ragged group as they headed down the corridor, then walked away with Arya to continue his day. The hush of the courtyard settled in behind them, disturbed only by the clank of distant scaffolding and the calls of workers high on the roofs. The rest of the day was a whirlwind of decisions, visitors, and fleeting conversations. Jon found himself summoned to meet with Lord Royce from the Vale, who had traveled to insist on the formal coronation. Then he spoke briefly with a trio of tradesmen from Braavos, who wished to renegotiate shipping rates, citing danger on the seas. At midday, he forced himself to eat a small meal in the privacy of his quarters, though the food had no taste on his tongue. He had never realized how quickly leadership could become a mire of details and demands. Late in the afternoon, he took a short break from it all, seeking a quiet corner in the Red Keep's library. The place still bore scorch marks in some halls, but the library itself had survived largely intact. Tall shelves filled with records and old tomes stood silent, dust motes drifting in the shafts of light from high windows. Jon wasn't much of a scholar, but something about the scent of parchment and old leather soothed him. It reminded him of Maester Aemon's study at Castle Black, the nights he spent there reading about the Long Night or the Targaryen kings, back when he thought history was just stories. He trailed a hand along the spines of books, letting his mind drift for a moment. Then he stopped at a massive volume titled, "The Great Houses of the Seven Kingdoms." Opening it revealed page after page of heraldry and lineage. He skimmed, noticing how each line was documented with fastidious detail, each house vying for a place in the tapestry of power. How many wars had these families started, all for the sake of lines on a page? He shut the book gently, unwilling to linger on those ghosts. He began to turn away but froze when he spotted Samwell Tarly in one of the aisles. Sam was seated at a broad battered desk, poring over some scroll. For a moment, Jon simply watched, letting a faint sense of nostalgia settle around him. Sam had changed, yes, but the earnestness in his friend's eyes remained the same as when they were black brothers at the wall. Jon approached quietly. Sam looked up and smiled in that disarming way of his, pushing a stray lock of hair aside. "Jon," he greeted. "I was wondering when I'd see you in here." Jon gave a half smile. "I didn't want to distract you." "Not at all," Sam assured him. "I've been working on reorganizing some of the records. So many were destroyed or lost during the chaos. It's a miracle we still have as much as we do." "Nen." Jon pulled out a chair and sat opposite Sam. Ghost sniffed the air once, then curled up near a dusty shelf. "How goes it?" Jon asked. Sam's eyes gleamed with intellectual excitement. "I found references to an old system. Something the Faith and certain maesters tried centuries ago, before the Targaryen conquest, to unify the realm under a more, let's say, merciful system than absolute monarchy." He lowered his voice, glancing over his shoulder, though no one else was near. "It's not exactly a democracy, but it involved councils chosen by local lords and—" Jon lifted a hand gently. "Slow down. You're speaking to me, remember?" Sam laughed, a warm sound in the cold library. "Right. Sorry. I just mean, I found some intriguing possibilities in the realm's past. Ways people tried to share power. It might help you, if you really want to replace the old ways with something better." Jon's chest felt both hopeful and heavy at the same time. "I do. But it's not so simple. The lords cling to tradition. They've seen too many break the rules or burn them entirely. They fear chaos." "Now," Sam nodded. "And maybe they're right to be fearful. But if we can show them a new system that works better, step by step, they might accept it. In the meantime, I could help refine some ideas, gather more information. We could propose a new council structure, expand what you've already done with your advisors." Jon considered Sam's words. "It might be worth a try. I don't want to force something upon them the way it's always been forced. But they need a reason to believe. Sam patted the scroll on the desk. "I'll keep studying. We'll find a way, Jon." The conversation that followed was quiet and laden with possibility. Sam laid out rudimentary ideas for a more inclusive system, one that might let lords and commoners alike have a voice. Jon listened, uncertain but curious. He recalled the wildling councils, how Mance Rayder once led by coalition in a sense. Perhaps Westeros could learn from that. That notion gave him a flicker of hope in an otherwise bleak day. When evening came, Jon stepped out into the courtyard once again. The sky was a wash of rich orange, the clouds lit by the dying sun. Workers bustled about, finishing repairs for the day. He could smell fresh wood, mortar, and the tang of sweat in the cooling air. The Red Keep was not the hive of luxury it once was. It was more akin to a construction site, a place of heavy labor and earnest rebuilding. Jon found that he preferred it this way, stripped of its vanities. He made his way to the top of the walls, where he could see King's Landing spread out before him. Arya joined him there, accompanied by Gendry, who had arrived the previous week at Jon's request. Gendry had proven himself skillful in forging weapons, and now, ironically, he was forging building materials to help repair the capital. Together they leaned on the battlements, looking out over rooftops and scaffolds. Gendry scratched the back of his neck. "Never thought I'd find myself working in the Red Keep," he said, sounding slightly amazed. "But I suppose it's better than forging swords for Lannisters." Arya gave him a playful jab in the ribs. "Don't forget, you're forging nails and hinges now, not fancy armor or that throne." Gendry rolled his eyes. "I can do more than nails, Arya, but if nails are what's needed, nails I'll make." Jon studied the horizon, where the last edge of sunlight glinted off the waters near Blackwater Bay. Small boats bobbed. The city seemed quieter than it had been. Perhaps it was exhaustion. The people were worn down by war, but also clinging to hope. They had no choice. "How are things in the forges?" Jon asked without turning his gaze. Gendry shrugged. "Busy, Dot. We're short on good steel and decent smiths, but we'll manage. People are grateful for honest work. I suppose that's something." Then Arya shifted her weight. "At least there are no longer lines of supplicants waiting to kill each other for the throne." Jon gave a humorless laugh. "No. They just line up to petition me about farmland and trade disputes. Sometimes I think I'd rather face a White Walker than a room full of squabbling lords." Arya smirked. "You might be the only one." They watched as the sky grew dark, the outline of the city becoming shapes of black and gray. Torches began to flicker in the streets below. The hum of activity turned to the hush of evening. For a time, they simply stood there, reminded of the nights they used to spend at Winterfell's battlements, gazing at the stars in the biting northern air. Eventually, Gendry excused himself to return to the workshops. Arya lingered a while longer, then she too left Jon to his solitude. He remained at the parapet, arms resting on the stone. Ghost's body pressed against his leg. The night wind ruffled his cloak. He stared out, remembering the countless times he had wondered who he was, where he belonged. Even now, with a title and a responsibility that covered the entire realm, he still wasn't sure if he belonged here, or if he was merely fulfilling some cosmic irony. He thought of Ygritte, of her wild laughter and fierce eyes. He thought of Daenerys, the heartbreak, the madness at the end, the sense of betrayal that burned like acid in his chest. He thought of his siblings scattered by war and duty, of Sam and all he had lost and found, of Tyrion's burden of guilt, and he thought of all the nameless dead whose ashes had drifted through this city not so long ago. Their memory haunted every corner, a quiet ghost urging him to do better. The Iron Throne was gone. In its place was an uncertain future. Jon had no illusions that it would be easy, or even successful, but he would not run from it, no matter how difficult. He had endured the long night, had faced betrayal and death itself. If he could do that, then he could lead a wounded realm towards something that might resemble peace. A soft footstep alerted him to another presence. He glanced back to see Tyrion approaching, clutching a half-full wineskin. The Lannister offered Jon a weary smile. Stepping up to the battlement, he took a long swallow, then extended it to Jon, who shook his head. Tyrion shrugged and took another drink. They stood in companionable silence, the hush of the city far below them. Finally, Tyrion spoke, his voice subdued. "Sometimes I wonder if there's a soul in this city who doesn't hate me, or blame me for something." He let out a small, hollow laugh. "I suppose it's a fair question." Jon sighed. "We've all done things we regret." "True enough," Tyrion said. "But still, one can't help feeling the eyes on one's back. I see it in the streets. People remember the Lannister crest, the destruction it brought. They see me wearing a new sigil on my cloak, but I doubt it washes away the blood." Jon considered his words. "Give them time. If you rule well as my hand, if you lead them to a better life, they might forgive, or at least forget." Tyrion nodded, though he did not look convinced. The wind played with his hair. "I hope so, I truly do, for all our sakes." He stared into the darkness, the wine loosening his tongue. "Jon, you've banned the Iron Throne and all it stood for. Yet sometimes I wonder, aren't we still building a new seat of power, just out of different wood and nails? Power is power, no matter how you dress it up." Jon looked at Tyrion. "It might be that power is always dangerous. But we can try to keep it in check, to share it more equally, to make sure the realm doesn't serve one person's vanity. I don't want them to fear me or worship me. I only want to protect them." Tyrion's gaze flicked to the city's lights below. "Not many who have held power have said such a thing and truly meant it. Let's hope we succeed." Nish. Jon thought of Sam's ideas, of the discontent among certain lords, of the refugees clamoring for help, of the city's scars. "We have to," he said finally, his voice firm. "I won't let the war start again. Not if I can help it." They lapsed into silence once more, the breeze humming around them. It was a fragile moment, one of quiet resolve amidst a realm half in ruins. Jon could almost imagine a day when the fields around King's Landing would be green again, when children would laugh instead of cry. Almost. After a time, Tyrion cleared his throat and took another small sip of wine. "Well, my lord, I suppose we both have duties in the morning. And the morning after that. And the morning after that." His tone was wry. "Best we try to get some sleep." Jon nodded. "You're right. Good night, Tyrion." With an awkward bow, Tyrion turned and left. Jon remained at the battlements for a short while longer, letting the night wrap around him. Ghost pressed against his leg. The stars, faint though they were above the city lights, winked in the heavens. Jon wondered if the old gods or the new were watching, if they might grant him a measure of their strength for the trials ahead. Perhaps they were silent, or perhaps they had done their part already. When he finally descended the steps to his chambers, the Red Keep was a ghostly place, lit by sparse torches in the corridors. Shadows danced on the walls, conjuring images of the city's bloody past. Jon pushed those phantoms from his mind. He entered his room, bolted the door behind him, and sank onto the edge of his narrow bed. After removing his cloak and boots, he let his head fall back against the wall, staring at the flickering flame of the single candle by his bedside. He was lord of the 7 kingdoms, or so they said, and yet he felt like a steward of a fragile peace, a caretaker of broken things. If he could guide them toward healing, if he could stop the cycle of bloodshed and tyranny, then perhaps his life would have meaning. That was all he could cling to in the lonely darkness. He closed his eyes, exhaustion pressing heavy upon him. Ghost settled on the floor, loyal and watchful. Sleep came slowly, as if uncertain whether it was safe to approach. In his dreams, he saw the sprawl of a city rebuilt without the Iron Throne, a place where feasts were shared by highborn and lowborn alike, where children ran free in streets unscarred by dragonfire. He saw a future where Winterfell and Dorne stood in mutual respect, where old grudges gave way to new alliances. It was a fragile, flickering vision, but it carried him through the night. Morning would bring new challenges, new disgruntled lords, new refugees, new demands. But he would rise with the dawn, as he always did. He would stand or sit on that plain wooden chair in the battered throne room. He would hear out each petition, weigh each argument, and try to lead with mercy. He would walk among the people, see their faces, and let their voices shape his decisions. He would lean on those he trusted, Tyrion, Davos, Sam, Arya, knowing that alone he could not shoulder the entirety of the realm's fate. And so, with the Iron Throne no longer an object of obsession, perhaps the Seven Kingdoms could begin to heal. The jagged swords of past conquests had been reduced to molten slag, taking with them a symbol of centuries of fear and ambition. What rose in its place might be humble, but it carried a rare hope. The day would come, Jon believed, when the scars of war might fade into memory. He would do everything in his power to ensure that day arrived, even if it cost him everything he had left to give. When he finally surrendered to slumber, the candle burned low, and Ghost's steady breathing filled the small room. No crown glinted in the darkness. No iron seat loomed in the gloom. There was only Jon Snow, Aegon Targaryen, the reluctant heir of two worlds, lost in the shadowy stillness, determined to bring peace to a kingdom that desperately needed it. The old ways were gone. A new dawn lay just beyond the window, where the city's broken stones waited for the first rays of light, waiting to see whether this time, at long last, hope would endure. It's she. Morning arrived with a muted glow behind ragged clouds, the same pale light that had illuminated the city's grief for weeks on end. A crow's cry pierced the dim hush, echoing over the Red Keep's walls. Jon stirred on his narrow bed, slowly blinking against the remnants of restless sleep. His candle had burned down to a shallow puddle of wax, leaving the room in a soft gloom. Ghost, stretched out across the threshold, lifted his head at the first sign of Jon's movement. Jon sat up and rubbed his hands over his face, wishing the ache in his bones would ease. No matter how many nights passed, he never seemed to find the deep rest he once had in Winterfell's chambers or even the cots of Castle Black. His dreams were crowded with half-formed images, blue-eyed wights lunging in the darkness, dragons shrieking above burning cities, friends and enemies alike merging into the shadows. Now he was awake, and the day's concerns replaced the night's phantoms. He rose and dressed in simple clothes, dark breeches and a leather tunic embroidered with the Stark sigil at the shoulder. He took care with his sword belt, adjusting Longclaw so it hung comfortably at his side. Though he wore no crown, the sword served as a reminder of who he was, and what he once fought for. Ghost stood, yawned, and padded over, pressing his muzzle briefly against Jon's hip. Outside in the corridor, servants bustled with quiet urgency. Some bowed as Jon passed, others merely dipped their heads and hurried on their way, carrying linens and supplies for the keep's ongoing repairs. Jon caught a faint whiff of fresh bread from somewhere below. The thought reminded him that he should eat, but it would have to wait. The day's tasks stretched before him like a labyrinth. He found Tyrion already awake and pacing in the antechamber that led to the council room. Dark circles rimmed the Lannister's eyes, and he clutched a parchment in one hand and a quill in the other. His hair stuck up on one side, as if he'd run his fingers through it a dozen times since rising. "Good morning," Jon said, pausing a few steps away. Ghost lingered near the doorway, ever watchful. Tyrion stopped pacing, offering Jon a weary smile that spoke of too little rest. "Another day in paradise, my lord. I do hope you're ready." Jon took a breath. "I doubt I'll ever be truly ready for what comes, but I'll do my best." Tyrion's mouth quirked into a half grin. "That's all any of us can do." He tapped the parchment. "We've had a raven from the Vale this morning. Lord Royce and the other regents for the boy, Robin Arryn that is, are pressing for an official ceremony. They seem even more insistent than yesterday." Jon nodded, not surprised. Word must have spread of his reluctance to schedule a coronation. That refusal would, in their eyes, make him look weak. Perhaps they were waiting for any sign that this new lord of the Seven Kingdoms was faltering. "I'll speak with them today. If we must hold some sort of ceremony, I'd rather get it done quickly, keep it simple, and turn our attention back to rebuilding." Tyrion bobbed his head in agreement. "I've drafted a few ideas for the event. We can review them with the council." His eyes flickered. "There's also news from Storm's End. Apparently they need more coin to repair their fleet. They argue that they suffered losses fighting side by side with your cause, and that the crown should repay them." Jon's jaw tightened. "Everyone's been asking for funds we barely have. We need the harbor here rebuilt, the roads cleared of rubble, and the farmland prepared for next planting. Nenatiboism. I'll tell them we'll see what can be done, but not to expect it all at once, Tyrion said, folding the parchment. Are you ready for the morning session? Jon rubbed the back of his neck. Yes. Let's go. They moved down the corridor to the old throne room. Sunlight slanted through high windows, illuminating the space that once housed the Iron Throne in all its intimidating glory. Now, the dais stood empty except for a sturdy wooden chair, unremarkable in every way. Red keep guards flanked the columns, though fewer than in the days of the Targaryen or Baratheon reigns. Tyrion entered first, with Jon just behind him, and Ghost trailing silently. Around the perimeter stood small folk and lesser merchants who'd come with requests. The lords and ladies who intended to speak had not yet arrived, or if they had, they were beyond these walls in the antechamber, waiting for a more formal summons. Jon eyed the humble throng, feeling the flutter of nervous energy that always came when he had to preside over the realm's concerns. If only leading an army of the living against the dead had been enough, this was, in many ways, more daunting. He took his seat on the wooden chair. Tyrion stood at his side, hands clasped before him. A steward stepped forward, a scroll in his grip, and began announcing the day's petitions. One by one, people approached, bowed or curtsied, and stated their business. Most were about missing family members, unpaid debts, or requests for a bit of land outside the city to rebuild a life. Jon listened carefully, tried to find fair resolutions, and instructed the stewards to keep records. He promised to send guards to search for lost loved ones when possible, though he suspected that many who had vanished in the city's recent turmoil might never be found. Time dragged, yet he gave each petitioner as much attention as he could. When an older man approached, hobbling on a cane, and speaking of grandsons who'd been conscripted by Queen Cersei's men and never returned, Jon felt the weight of guilt pressing on him once again. He made a note, promising to investigate. The man thanked him with tears in his eyes. Jon's chest tightened, knowing that the old man's plea might lead nowhere. Too many men died in the last battles, their remains swallowed by chaos. After an hour, a servant offered Jon a cup of watered wine, which he accepted with a grateful nod. Tyrion kept checking the parchment in his hand. Soon, more important guests would arrive, expecting a different sort of hearing. Jon gave a sign to the steward that he was ready to see the next set of petitioners, the ones carrying the weighty demands of their lordships. The steward bowed and went to the far door, where a cluster of well-dressed men and women waited. The first to be admitted was Lord Royce himself, a heavy-set man with a determined expression. His presence was as solid as the armor he often wore. Two attendants, both from the Vale, accompanied him, their attire bearing the moon and falcon sigil. Behind them stood a cluster of knights or lesser lords, their crests indicating loyalty to House Arryn. They moved down the aisle, their footsteps echoing on the stone floor. Jon watched them approach, keeping his face impassive. Ghost, seated at the base of the dais, regarded the newcomers with silent wariness. Lord Royce inclined his head in a polite, if somewhat stiff, bow. The attendants followed suit. "My lord," Royce began, voice resonant, "I bring regards from the Vale and from Lord Robin Arryn, who remains at the Eyrie. We trust the rebuilding of King's Landing continues apace, though we also note that the Vale stands ready to assist, should we receive certain assurances." Jon nodded. "I value the Vale's support." Royce cleared his throat, casting a glance at Tyrion. "We wish to confirm a date for your coronation. The realm needs the stability of a formally recognized ruler. Traditions must be upheld, or so many will doubt the legitimacy of this new era." Jon drew in a slow breath. "I understand the importance of tradition. However, the city is in dire need. Food is scarce, entire districts lie in ruins. A grand ceremony seems ill-timed." Royce's brow furrowed, but his tone remained respectful. "We do not ask for excess or extravagance. A modest ceremony, as your hand has already discussed with me. Enough so that the lords and ladies of the realm can witness you take your oath before the gods and the people." "Nauman?" Jon glanced at Tyrion, then met Royce's gaze. "Very well, we'll arrange a ceremony. It will be brief and plain, in respect for those who lost everything. No feasting, no fanfare. But the realm will see that I accept the role." Royce inclined his head again, relief evident in the set of his shoulders. "That will satisfy the Vale." Then he gave the barest hint of a wry smile. "And if I may say, my lord, such humility is refreshing." Jon did not return the smile. He only nodded. "I appreciate your cooperation. Is there anything else?" One of Royce's attendants stepped forward, a woman with a stern expression and a band of silver across her forehead. "My lord, we also bear tidings of certain bandits who have fled into the Mountains of the Moon. We believe they have ties to some of the unsavory factions that arose during the war. They've been harrying villages on the fringes of the Vale. We request the Crown's assistance in dealing with them." Jon's hands gripped the arms of the wooden chair. "My men are spread thin, patrolling the roads around King's Landing and trying to safeguard refugees. I can spare a few nights, but the Vale may need to handle most of that matter on its own, at least until we've restored some order here." Royce nodded. "We have men of our own we can send. We ask only that you acknowledge our efforts, and that if it becomes too large of a threat, you'll provide reinforcements." "That seems fair," Jon agreed. "I'll do what I can." Satisfied, Lord Royce and his attendants withdrew, leaving behind the quiet patter of official footsteps receding across stone. Next came two knights from the Westerlands. They too bowed stiffly, introduced themselves, and spoke of trouble near the Gold Road, where outlaws were plundering caravans of goods meant for the capital. Jon granted them leave to form a temporary alliance with local bannermen to quell the threat. He could promise little else in the way of aid, for the city had few soldiers to spare. And so it went. Lords and emissaries arrived with questions, demands, requests for coin or troops. Jon faced them all, occasionally turning to Tyrion for counsel, though Tyrion often simply nodded, letting Jon's instincts guide the decisions. The minutes stretched into hours, and the courtyard beyond the throne room windows grew brighter, then began its slow drift toward afternoon. At last, a lull came. The great doors closed behind the final petitioners, leaving Jon to slump back in his chair, exhaling. Tyrion passed him a cup of water which he gratefully sipped. Ghost, who had remained eerily still throughout the session, finally stood and shook his massive coat. Tyrion broke the silence. "That was slightly less painful than yesterday." Jon let out a breath. "Perhaps, but each day brings new burdens. I'm not sure if I'm up to this." Tyrion's brow knit, and he laid a hand briefly on Jon's arm. "You bear the weight better than most kings I've served, or seen, or known in stories." Jon lowered his gaze to the worn dais. "I'm not a king." "You will be," Tyrion said softly. "Ceremony or no. You're the one they look to." Jon nodded. "We should gather the council to plan this coronation. Best to do it sooner rather than let them keep pressing." "Nantsia." Tyrion patted his arm and stepped away. "I'll arrange it, perhaps in a fortnight. That might give us time to invite Sansa and the others, assuming they wish to come." He watched Jon for a sign of reaction. Jon's mouth tightened. "We should invite Sansa. She is Lady of the North. She should be part of this. Whether she'll come or not, I can't say." Tyrion offered a small shrug. "We can't force her, but I suspect she'll attend if only to ensure the North's interests are heard." His tone was measured, though she left King's Landing with a bitter taste. Jon recalled the last he'd seen of his sister. She was proud, distant, and determined never to be subject to another's tyranny. He understood her sentiment, even if it meant a widening rift between them. "Send a raven to Winterfell?" he said quietly. "I'd like her to come if she can." Tyrion bowed. "I'll see to it." He turned toward the exit, leaving Jon alone in the emptied throne room. Jon rose from the chair, running a hand over its rough surface. The wood was scarred, as though it had seen better days. He wondered how many of the lords who came to petition him secretly longed for the old Iron Throne in its place, that monstrous seat that symbolized absolute power. He took a step back, Ghost at his heel, and left the hall. The corridors of the Red Keep led him to a small garden, battered by the war but still maintaining a few patches of greenery. Workers had cleared rubble, planted new seeds, and salvaged old vines that had not withered entirely. A single bench stood near a fountain, the water trickling quietly into a cracked basin. John sat down, letting the soft chatter of birds and the rustle of leaves calm him. He gazed at the sky, pale blue with streaks of gray clouds drifting past. It occurred to him that he rarely saw the wide-open heavens in King's Landing without an undercurrent of dread. Once, dragons had soared overhead, reminding him of what power could do in the wrong hands. Now, the sky was empty, save for gulls and crows. He tried to decide if that emptiness felt like loss or relief. A soft footstep behind him made him turn. Arya emerged from behind a half-grown hedge, her eyes scanning the small garden with a restless energy. She wore breeches and a leather vest, her hair tied back. A short sword hung at her hip, along with the ever-present dagger. She approached the bench and sat beside him. The fountain's gentle splash the only sound between them for a few heartbeats. "How was your morning?" she asked quietly, folding her arms over her knees. John gave a small shrug. Endless petitions, talks of bandits, rebuilding, and demands for a coronation. The usual. Arya's lips curved into a faint smirk. "I don't envy you." Then her expression softened. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to sound dismissive. You carry a heavy burden." John shook his head. "I'm not offended. Some days, I'd trade places with anyone who'd let me. But I suppose I'd only be running from the responsibilities I agreed to take on." Arya studied him for a moment. "I spoke with Gendry this morning. He mentioned that the forges are swamped with orders for nails, hinges, even new hoes and scythes for farmland. Everything except swords. He said it's a strange change, but a welcome one." John thought about that. "Yes, we need more tools than weapons these days. If that holds, maybe we'll finally have some peace." She nodded, her gaze drifting across the garden. "If you manage this coronation quickly, perhaps you can set a new tone, something that tells the realm we're not returning to the old ways." John frowned slightly, glancing at the battered fountain. "I hope so. But part of me wonders if a ceremony is exactly what the old ways demand. Crowning a single ruler, even if the throne is gone, it feels like repeating the same cycle." Arya tapped her fingers on her belt. "You can't change everything at once. Maybe Sam's ideas about councils and shared power will help. But for now you have to keep the realm together. That means some traditions, like a public acceptance of rule." He gave her a sidelong look. "You sound like Tyrion." She snorted. "Careful with that. I'm not about to start drinking wine all day and making clever quips." John surprised himself with a slight chuckle. The moment of levity warmed him, however briefly. He reached over and laid a hand on Arya's. "Thank you for staying here, even if it's only for a while. It helps to have family around." Her gaze flicked to his face and she squeezed his hand. "I won't stay forever. You know me. I need to roam. But I won't leave you to handle everything alone. Not yet." He nodded, letting the silence settle again. The trickle of the fountain was steady, and the occasional caw of a distant gull broke the hush. Finally, Arya stood. "I'm going out into the city for a bit," she said. "I want to see how the people are faring. With my own eyes, not just from the council's reports." John knew better than to discourage her. "Be careful." She raised an eyebrow. "I'm always careful." Then she was gone, her footsteps light as a cat's. John remained a few minutes more, gathering the will to resume the day's obligations. Ghost lay down by the bench, panting softly. At length, John rose and scratched the direwolf's ears, then headed back inside. He found Sam in the council chambers, hunched over a table littered with scrolls. The sunlight that poured in from the tall windows illuminated the dust motes swirling in the air. Sam was so engrossed in his reading that he didn't notice John approach until Ghost's nails clicked on the floor. He looked up with a start, then flashed a smile. "John," he said, pushing a scroll aside, "I was just reading about the old councils in Pentos, from hundreds of years ago. It's interesting how they balanced power among merchant families and princes." John lifted a hand gently. "I'm sure it's fascinating, Sam. But I'm afraid I have matters we need to discuss. The coronation is becoming unavoidable." Sam's expression sobered. "I suspected as much. The lords want a show, even if you don't." He glanced down at a half-written parchment. "Well, there's a line here I found. a reference to a custom in Old Town centuries ago, where the people would gather and the new leader swore an oath before them. They called it the Oath of Stewardship, or something like that, placing the well-being of the city above personal ambition. He hesitated. It might be something to adapt, if you truly want to emphasize that you're not a tyrant on a throne. John took the parchment, scanning the old text. He could make out phrases about service, duty, and humility. This could be a good start, he murmured. We'll see if the High Septon agrees. Sam tapped another scroll. Speaking of which, I've arranged a meeting with the High Septon this afternoon. He wants to discuss the ceremony as well. It seems he's concerned about the spiritual implications of melting down the Iron Throne. John felt a surge of annoyance. Let him be concerned. The Faith didn't step in to stop the wars fought over that thing. Sam's voice was measured. Be that as it may, we need them on our side. If they sense you're ignoring the gods, it could cause unrest. John sighed and passed a hand over his eyes. I'll talk to him. Sam nodded, relief in his posture. Good. Now there's also the matter of farmland outside the city. Davos and I are drawing up a plan to reassign certain fields to refugees and small folk who lost their homes. We'll need official approval, of course. John sat at the edge of the table, scanning the sketches Sam laid out. They showed the crownlands, with sections marked for future farmland, small communities, and protected routes. It looked painstakingly organized, exactly what John had hoped for. This is good. We can allocate men to guard those roads, keep out bandits. The city relies on them for food. Demnesara. Sam's expression brightened. I'll finalize the details, then bring them to the next council meeting. They were interrupted by the arrival of Sir Davos, who entered quietly, but with purpose. He inclined his head toward John and Sam. We've just had word that a ship from the Iron Islands docked at the harbor, he said. They've come to pay respects, or so they say. Carry the sigil of House Pike. I can escort them to you if you like. John remembered the uncertain loyalty from the Iron Islands. Yara Greyjoy had supported Daenerys once, but after the war's end, the islands mostly kept to themselves. He nodded. Yes, bring them in. Let's see what they want. Davos stepped out, and a few moments later, two representatives entered the chamber. One was a rangy man with braided salt and pepper hair. The other was a woman with a scar running across her cheek, her attire stitched with the Kraken sigil. Both smelled faintly of brine and stale sweat, as if they'd sailed for days. They bowed in a rough manner, no courtesy flourishes. John stood, noticing Sam quietly shift to the side, letting John take the lead. Ghost rumbled low in his throat, and the woman eyed the direwolf with guarded interest. Welcome to King's Landing, John said. I trust your voyage was safe. The woman answered, voice firm. Hey, safe enough, my lord. My name is Neria Pike, and this is Corvin Harlaw. We come on behalf of Yara Greyjoy, Lady of the Iron Islands. John studied them, recalling Yara's directness. And what message does she send? Neria stepped forward, crossing her arms. We've heard you're set to have a coronation. The Iron Islands wish to know where we stand in this new order. We offered our ships once before, to the Dragon Queen. Many of our people died in her wars. Now, the Dragon Queen is gone, and the Iron Throne is melted down. So we ask, will the Iron Islands be left to their own ways, or must we bend the knee again? Nimwen tried. John paused, choosing his words with care. I won't force the Iron Islands into submission. If you wish to remain part of the Seven Kingdoms under my rule, we can negotiate terms of autonomy. Something that respects your customs, but keeps the islands within the realm's protection. If you prefer independence, we can discuss that as well. I have no desire to repeat the mistakes of conquerors. Ben. Neria exchanged a glance with Corvin. It was clear they hadn't expected such an offer. The Iron Islands had always chafed under mainland rule, yet they also knew isolation came at a price. We'll convey your words to Lady Yara, she said. But if we choose to remain part of the realm, we want a guarantee. No forced religion from the faith of the Seven, and no taxes that bleed us dry. John inclined his head. That's reasonable. Every part of the realm is struggling to rebuild. We'll set fair taxes, scaled to the resources you have. As for religion, The North follows the old gods, and the Ironborn have the drowned god. I won't force you to worship any differently. No. Then Orike was asked. Neria gave a curt nod, though a hint of respect flickered in her eyes. We'll be at the harbor for a few days, gathering supplies. If you have more to say, send a messenger. If not, we'll sail back with your answer. Jon noted that she had given him no pledge of loyalty or promise of peaceful conduct. Only a guarded acceptance. Still, it was more progress than he might have hoped for. Very well. Thank you for coming. Biddy. She and Corvin bowed again, then departed with Davos guiding them out. Sam let out a breath, as if relieved no confrontation had taken place. Ghost sat up, ears pricked, watching the doorway through which the Iron Islanders had left. Jon looked at Sam. What do you think? Will they stay or go? Sam tapped his quill against his chin. Hard to say. The Ironborn are proud. But if they see advantages to staying in the realm, like trading with the mainland, receiving protection against pirates, they might remain. They decide they can raid and reeve, without repercussions by being independent. They might try that. We'll see. Jon considered his next steps. For now, let's keep them at ease. If we show them respect, maybe they'll return the gesture. He rubbed his temples, weary. And if they don't, we'll handle that problem when it comes. Sam gathered a few scrolls. I'll make a note to send a proposal for trade agreements. See if that sweetens the deal. Jon looked at him gratefully. Thank you, Sam. They spent the next hour reviewing the farmland plans, adjusting certain allocations based on the latest counts of refugees. The room grew stuffy, and Jon had to stand near a window for a few moments, letting the mild breeze cool his face. Each new set of numbers made him realize how large the scope of this realm truly was, and how overwhelming its needs. Around midday, Tyrion appeared, quietly reminding Jon of the appointment with the High Septon. Jon summoned his resolve and followed Tyrion through the castle corridors. The route took them past blackened tapestries and scorched walls that still bore traces of dragonfire. Servants bustled, carrying buckets of mortar or planks of wood. One corridor was closed off entirely by scaffolding, the ceiling overhead dangerously cracked. They reached a small audience chamber near the keep sept. Inside waited the High Septon, a tall, thin man with deep-set eyes. Unlike the previous High Sparrow, he wore finely stitched robes of white and gold, though not so ostentatious as the wealthy Septons once did. He rose to greet Jon, bowing with a measured grace. Lord Snow, the man intoned in a gentle voice. May the Seven bless you in your endeavors. Jon inclined his head politely. And may they guide us all in rebuilding. The High Septon's gaze flicked over Tyrion, as if recalling the man's many indiscretions. A faint tension crackled in the room. Tyrion offered a polite nod and folded his hands behind his back, letting Jon lead the conversation. Thank you for meeting me, Jon said. I understand you have concerns about the ceremony. The High Septon clasped his hands at his waist. Indeed. As you know, tradition holds that the ruler of the Seven Kingdoms is anointed by the faith. You have chosen a different path, melting down the Iron Throne and refusing the title of king. This troubles some followers who see it as a rejection of the faith's blessing. Then, Jon measured his words carefully. I mean no disrespect to the faith. I have seen too much death come from the lust for that throne. I don't intend to spurn the gods or those who worship them, but I do believe we must change how we rule. The High Septon pursed his lips. Change is inevitable, my lord, and sometimes it is necessary. But the faith can offer comfort to the people, help unify them under your leadership, if you allow it. If you are willing to receive the anointment with the holy oils, it would set many hearts at ease. No. Jon met the man's gaze steadily. I have no objection to anointment, though I believe the old gods still watch over the north. If the Seven see fit to bless my rule, I won't turn that blessing away. The High Septon lowered his head in acquiescence. Then we can proceed. Do you have a date in mind for this ceremony? Tyrion stepped in. We were thinking a fortnight from now. That should allow time for guests to arrive. Lady Sansa from Winterfell, representatives from other regions. The High Septon nodded slowly. Very well, we should hold the ceremony in the Great Sept of Baelor. Well, what remains of it? It was damaged. But parts of the structure still stand. We can erect a temporary dais in the courtyard, so the people may witness. John's jaw tightened at the memory of how the great sept of Baylor had been destroyed once before, blasted apart by wildfire. Now it was again in ruins, though an attempt to rebuild had begun. If it's safe, then that is acceptable. The High Septon's thin lips curved into a small smile. We shall see to the details. The faith stands ready to guide you in your vow. Tyrion cleared his throat. Perhaps we might keep the vow short and direct, out of respect for those still mourning the devastation. Simplicity might suit this occasion. The High Septon arched a brow, but he gave a gracious nod. As you wish. Our scribes will prepare an appropriate liturgy. We shall anoint Lord Snow with the 7 oils, as tradition demands. The ceremony need not be more than a solemn acceptance of his duties before the eyes of men and gods. John felt a peculiar sense of relief that the man didn't insist on pageantry or a sermon. Thank you, he said. I promise I will do my best to lead justly. The High Septon placed a hand on John's shoulder. May the 7 bless your reign, my lord. He bowed again, and John responded with a polite tilt of his head. With that, the meeting ended. As John and Tyrion left, stepping back into the corridor, John exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. That went better than expected, Tyrion remarked. No lectures on sin, no demands for gold to rebuild the Septe. John managed a faint smile. Yes, though I'm sure they'll want gold eventually. They always do, Tyrion said with a wry note in his voice. But one hurdle at a time. He guided John back toward the council chambers, where they were greeted by a flurry of activity. A steward beckoned for John's attention, rattling off a request from some merchants in Flea Bottom. Davos hovered near a table, stacked with shipping ledgers, running a hand over his balding head in exasperation. Sam was buried in scrolls, discussing farmland allocations with a minor lord from the Stormlands. It seemed each corner of the room bore evidence of the kingdom's slow mending, each step forward an exercise in cooperation and compromise. John spent the rest of the afternoon moving from one conversation to the next. He spoke with Davos about ensuring enough ships were ready to bring supplies from the Reach. He reviewed lists of repairs with the castle's master builder, who reported a growing shortage of timber. He paused to sign off on a small but urgent request for medicine to tend to an outbreak of illness in a refugee camp. The tasks blurred together, yet John forced himself to remain present, to address each need. When he finally emerged from the council chambers, dusk was approaching. The corridors were awash in orange light that spilled through narrow windows, igniting dust motes in a hazy glow. John realized he'd missed the midday meal entirely, and his stomach rumbled in protest. He made for the kitchen storerooms, thinking to fetch a chunk of bread or some dried meat. Ghost kept close, weaving around workers carrying crates. The aroma of fresh bread and roasting onions hit John's nose, intensifying his hunger. In the storeroom, a tired-looking cook recognized him and hurried to offer a small loaf wrapped in cloth. John thanked her quietly and slipped away, tearing into the bread as he walked. It was still warm, and the taste grounded him in the present moment, reminding him of simpler times at the wall, when a bit of hot food was a gift. He headed to the courtyard to breathe fresh air. Shadows stretched across the warm cobblestones, and the last rays of the sun tinged the western sky with pink and gold. He saw Arya approaching from the far gate. Her gait was brisk, her expression unreadable. She noticed him standing there and nodded once, striding closer. "How is the city?" John asked, swallowing a mouthful of bread. Arya's lips quirked. "Better than it was. Flea Bottom is still a mess, but some of the old city is beginning to look less like a war zone. People are out in the streets again. They're wary though. I can see it in their faces. They're expecting another war or another mad ruler." John's appetite dulled, and he folded the cloth over what remained of his loaf. "I don't blame them." Arya stepped closer, leaning against a low wall. "I heard talk that some men are grumbling about a northern bastard in charge, but others say you're fair, that you're trying to help." John looked at the evening sky. "I suppose that's all I can hope for. At least they see I'm doing what I can." She nodded. I passed by the refugees outside the gates. The tents stretch on and on. There are so many. And more keep arriving from the Riverlands. We'll need to find them permanent homes soon or risk an uprising when winter comes. Demis Hall. Ross. Joan's throat tightened at the thought of so many desperate families living in makeshift camps. Yes, he said softly. Sam and Davos are working on farmland allocations. It's slow going, but we'll make progress. Arya fell silent for a moment, then gave his arm a light squeeze. You're doing better than any ruler I've seen. Don't doubt that. He mustered a grateful, if fleeting, smile. Thank you, Arya. She released his arm and glanced toward the keep. Should we find some dinner? You look like you haven't eaten all day. Jon nodded. Good idea. They crossed the courtyard together as the sun sank fully beyond the horizon, leaving a wash of twilight over the battered stones. Inside, the halls were lit by torches that crackled softly, guiding them to a side chamber where the castle's denizens often took meals. A long table stood in the center, bearing simple fare: stewed vegetables, roasted fish, and fresh bread. A few guards and servants sat along the benches, exchanging quiet conversation. They stood when Jon and Arya entered, bowing respectfully. But Jon waved them back to their seats. He and Arya gathered plates and served themselves modest portions. They took places at the end of the table, not quite separate from the others, but leaving some space. Arya ate with brisk efficiency, occasionally tossing a scrap to Ghost. Jon ate slowly, the day's exhaustion pressing on him. At one point, Tyrion passed by, noticed them, and joined briefly to grab a quick plate of food. He offered a polite greeting, exchanged a few words about the day's events, then excused himself, mumbling something about urgent letters he had to write. When they finished, Jon and Arya rose. Arya stretched her arms overhead, glancing about. I might head to the training yard, she said. Need to keep sharp. Jon nodded, recalling the times they sparred at Winterfell as children. He imagined she'd find no shortage of men in the yard willing to test her steel, though few would last long against her skill. Go on. I'll head to my chambers. They parted ways. Jon moved through the dim corridors, passing fewer servants now as many retired to their quarters. The hush of night settled in. Outside, the city would be in partial darkness, with only lanterns and torches lighting certain streets. Beyond that, tents of refugees would cluster in anxious gloom. The weight of their plight tugged at Jon's conscience. He paused at a narrow window, looking down at the city lights and the black expanse of the bay beyond. In the far distance, a few scattered lanterns of ships bobbed on the water. How many dreams had he harbored once, of a life in Winterfell, or of a simple existence in the Watch? Now he was neither a sworn brother of the Watch, nor a quiet son of the North. He was trapped in a role that might shape the future of Westeros, for better or worse. Ghost nudged his hand, and Jon patted the direwolf's head, absently continuing down the corridor until he reached his chambers. The door groaned as he pushed it open. A single candle had been lit by a servant, its flame wavering in a draught. The room felt slightly chilly, and he realized he missed the heavy furs of the north. But in King's Landing, the nights were mild enough that a single blanket often sufficed. He removed his sword belt and cloak, setting them aside. For a moment, he stood there, uncertain if he should lie down or review the day's messages. The responsibilities never seemed to end. But exhaustion won out. He unlaced his tunic and lay on the bed, letting his head rest against the thin pillow. Ghost settled at the foot of the bed, as he often did. Jon stared at the ceiling, worn stones that had witnessed the madness of past kings and queens. Somewhere overhead, ravens might nest in the eaves, occasionally croaking in the night. He let his mind drift, listening to the distant murmur of the sea, trying to find some measure of peace in the knowledge that he had done what he could today. His thoughts turned to the coronation. He pictured a makeshift dais in the Great Sept's courtyard, throngs of onlookers uncertain whether to cheer or remain silent. He imagined the High Septon anointing him with oil, the press of curious faces. He saw his northern kin, perhaps Sansa, standing solemnly, her face unreadable. Then his mind flashed to the ashes of the Iron Throne, the twisted metal that once beckoned conquerors to ruin. He remembered Denris' eyes, that last moment before everything shattered. Pain lanced through him, but he forced himself to breathe and let it ebb. This was his chance to break the cycle, to prove that rulership need not be a tyranny. He had to believe it was possible. Slowly, he turned onto his side, facing the low flame of the candle, letting the flicker mesmerize him. Ghost's breathing lulled him, each exhale a gentle reassurance that he wasn't entirely alone. Time slipped away, and he found himself sliding into a drowsy half-sleep. Whispers of thought spun through his mind. The farmland allocations, the bandits near Rosby, the Vale's demands, the Iron Islands' uncertainty. They all jostled for space in his tired brain. Eventually his eyes closed, and he drifted into a fitful slumber. In his dreams, he was walking in a forest of weirwood trees, their white trunks forming a silent army. Crimson leaves swayed, and the faces carved in the bark watched him with ancient, unreadable gazes. He sensed a presence behind him, but when he turned, there was only empty space. A soft wind carried the faint sound of a dragon's roar, distant and mournful. He moved forward, unsure of where the path led, until the trees parted to reveal a wide plain of snow and a looming darkness that pulsed like a storm cloud. He jolted awake, heart pounding. The candle had burned low, only a stub of wax left. Ghost lifted his head, ears pricked. John let out a shaking breath, pressing the heel of his hand to his brow. Just a dream, he told himself. But somewhere in the recesses of his mind, he recalled that the old gods and the new sometimes sent warning visions. He sat up, waiting for his heart to still. The room was silent. Through the narrow window, he could glimpse the moon, half veiled by drifting clouds. The wind whispered beyond the stone walls. Slowly, he lay back down, forcing his body to relax. Whatever the dream meant, if anything, it would have to wait. Dawn would bring the next wave of challenges, and the realm would demand his strength once more. He let himself sink into the darkness again, hoping for a few hours of rest before the city woke with its usual clamor. The old burdens hadn't vanished, but a faint thread of determination wound through him. He would face the day, the coronation, the uncertain alliances, whatever came. There was no Iron Throne to claim or to fear, only a seat of responsibility that he had shouldered for the sake of the living. And in that quiet, flickering space between sleep and consciousness, he let himself believe that, perhaps this time, they might find a peace that lasted. John woke in the pre-dawn dark, heart thudding from a dream that was already slipping from his mind. Something about trees, tall, pale trunks, and red leaves stirring in an unseen wind. He sat up, pressing his palms to his eyes. The dregs of sleep clung to him, and he forced a slow breath, trying to calm his racing pulse. Beside the bed, Ghost blinked awake, lifting his head as though to check on his master. The direwolf's ears were pricked, alert to John's unease. John exhaled, then swung his feet to the floor. He dressed quietly, tugging on a shirt and pulling dark trousers over his long legs. The chill of the flagstones seeped up through his boots, though the southern climate was nowhere near as cold as the north. A single lantern, lit by some dutiful servant during the night, cast wavering shadows on the walls. Outside, the Red Keep's corridors lay in half-darkness, torches burning low and spaced far apart. He opened the door gently, Ghost slipping out at his side. Together, they traversed halls that were nearly deserted at this hour. A guard here or there offered a nod, their mail jangling in the silence. John preferred these quiet moments, when he could almost imagine the city was at peace, and he was just another man crossing the courtyard before dawn. He descended a spiral staircase that led to the yard where a handful of sentries kept watch. They saluted him, and he answered with a curt nod. Beyond the gate, the sky was beginning to lighten, stained a dull grayish blue. He made his way toward the stables, exhaling clouds of breath in the crisp morning air. The stable door creaked as he slipped inside. Within, a few horses stomped and snorted, rustling in their stalls. John reached for an oil lantern on a hook, lifting it to cast light over the straw-lined floor. He moved to one of the stalls where a dark bay mare eyed him warily. He hadn't ridden her before, but the stablemaster said she was sure-footed in the uneven streets. John murmured a greeting, offering the back of his hand for her to sniff. The mare whickered, and he stroked her neck gently. With practiced care, he fitted her with a bridle and saddle, leading her out into the courtyard. A curious stable hand came shuffling over, yawning. "My lord," the young man said, voice hushed by the stillness of dawn. "Shall I accompany you?" John shook his head. "I'll manage. Thank you." He wasn't planning a long journey, just an early ride through the city to see things for himself before the day's burdens began. Sometimes, the only way to truly gauge the people's mood was to move among them quietly, unannounced. He mounted, settling onto the saddle. Ghost padded alongside. The guards at the gate recognized him at once, swinging the creaking iron open without question. They called after him to be careful. He waved in acknowledgement, though he kept his face impassive. The city lay before him, its streets tinted pale blue by the earliest light. Mare's hooves clopped on cobblestone as he guided her through the winding lanes. Here and there, rubble still formed small mounds by the roadside, awaiting carting. Damaged buildings stood with sagging rooftops, some roped off to prevent passers-by from venturing too close. But he saw signs of life too. A baker's shop with smoke trickling from the chimney, a lamplighter finishing his nightly round, a woman in a worn cloak carrying buckets of water. John kept his hood raised to avoid attracting too much attention. He wasn't certain he would pass unnoticed, but perhaps in the gloom, few would recognize him. Ghost, of course, was a giveaway. A white direwolf was not something seen in the capital every day. Yet the few people who noticed him simply stared, wide-eyed and respectful, or perhaps fearful. He tried to meet their gazes, offering a small nod when possible, though it was difficult to dispel their apprehension. Rumors still whispered that the direwolf signaled northern sorcery or a demonic omen. He wished people would see Ghost for what he was, a loyal companion, not a monster. He turned down a narrow lane leading toward Flea Bottom. There, the city's desperation was stark. Makeshift tents crowded the alleyways. Small fires flickered in cracked braziers, and gaunt faces peered out from beneath threadbare blankets. Children scampered through the mud, seeking scraps of food. John's throat tightened as he surveyed the scene. The realm might be under his protection, but it was far from secure. Too many were homeless or hungry. They needed something beyond promises. He guided the mare carefully around a sleeping figure huddled beside a broken cart. Ghost trotted ahead, sniffing the air. A cluster of men crouched near a sputtering fire, turning hollow eyes on John as he passed. One of them muttered something inaudible, and another tugged at his sleeve, cautioning him to stay silent. John didn't stop. He knew his presence might cause tension, but their expressions lingered in his mind. After passing through Flea Bottom, he emerged onto a slightly wider street lined with shops. Most of the windows were shuttered, but a few showed signs of life. A cobbler hammered leather inside his cramped workshop, and a pair of sisters sorted vegetables in front of a small stall. The city was waking slowly, hesitant to trust the day. John sighed, guiding his horse back toward the main thoroughfare that led uphill to the Red Keep. When he reached the keep's gates once more, the sun had begun to peek above the rooftops, painting the sky in shades of orange and pale gold. He slipped inside the walls and dismounted, passing the mare's reins to the stable hand who had appeared to greet him. Ghost shook dust from his fur and followed as John walked toward his private entrance in the keep's outer ward. A figure waited there in the courtyard, arms crossed, a lithe shape with a sheathed sword at the hip. As John drew closer, he recognized Aria's slight smirk. She must have spotted him riding out earlier, or perhaps she simply knew him well enough to guess he'd be roaming the city at dawn. "You're up early," she remarked, matching his pace as he crossed the stones. "Out for a morning patrol?" He gave a half shrug. "I needed to see how things stood without the usual crowd of guards and stewards around me." Aria nodded, her sharp gaze flicking over him. "And what did you see?" John exhaled. People huddled in rubble, begging for bread. Some shops open. Some families trying to return to normal. But it's slow. The city isn't healing as quickly as the lords might want to believe. Now, Aria's expression was grim. "No, it isn't." She adjusted the leather bracer on her wrist. I've been walking the streets too, only not on horseback. Flea bottoms like a tinderbox. If we don't do more soon, desperation could turn to riots. John grimaced. We're trying. Rations, farmland allocations, shelter. It all takes time. He ran a hand over his hair, wishing he had better news for her. I need to meet with Tyrion and the council about speeding up construction. We can't wait months for decent housing. Nain. Arya gestured for him to follow her toward a small archway leading into the keep. Then, let's go find Tyrion. He's probably already in the council chambers, reading letters. They passed into the keep, where servants and minor officials were beginning their day's work. A few paused to bow as John passed, though Arya moved among them as though invisible, her presence overshadowed by his. They descended a short flight of steps and came to the large double doors of the council chamber. 2 guards stood there, clad in patched cloaks bearing the Stark sigil. They opened the doors at Jon's approach. Inside, Tyrion was indeed present. Perched on a tall stool at the round table, a stack of parchment beside him. Candlelight still fought with the early sunlight streaming through the high windows, creating shifting shadows. Ser Davos was there as well, quietly conferring with a steward. Sam pored over a ledger, quill in hand, his lips moving silently as he calculated sums. Tyrion looked up, nibbling the end of his quill. Jon, Arya. Good morning. I've got a list of issues longer than the Rosariad. Shall we begin? Menisedi. Jon sighed and stepped forward, claiming a seat opposite Tyrion. Arya lingered near the door, crossing her arms and observing. Go settled at Jon's feet, ears flicking. Go on, Jon said. Tyrion lifted the first parchment. We have the matter of additional timber needed for reconstruction. The crown coffers are stretched thin, and the nearest substantial forests are in the Riverlands or further north. We'll need to negotiate for shipments or force them, but I assume we prefer the former. Jon nodded. Yes, we need to buy or trade for it. Forcing it would only lead to more resentment. Tyrion tapped the parchment. I'll send ravens to the lords of the Riverlands. Perhaps they'll be willing to supply timber in exchange for leniency on certain taxes. But we should be careful not to make promises we can't keep. Ser Davos folded his arms. We can also look to the Westerlands, though their forests aren't as rich, and shipping from the north might be feasible if White Harbor can coordinate. But that's a long haul. Jon considered. We can reach out to Sansa. She might assist if it benefits the realm. The north might be cautious, but they won't ignore the city's plight. Send a letter to her, Davos. Ask if White Harbor can spare any timber. Davos nodded, taking note on a scrap of parchment. Tyrion moved to the next item. Harbor repairs are proceeding slowly. The workers say they need better wages, or they'll leave for easier labor upriver, where rebuilding efforts pay more. We could raise their wages, but that means tightening the budget elsewhere. Likely the castle's repairs, or the city watch. Arya shifted, brow furrowing. Jon glanced at her, then turned to Tyrion. Pay them a fair wage, he said, voice steady. The harbor is vital for trade. If we lose those workers, we'll be set back months. Cut back on the keep's renovations if we must. The city's rebuilding takes priority over our own comforts. Tyrion flashed a quick grin, though it carried a hint of tension. Practical as ever. Very well. He scribbled a note on his parchment. Next, about the farmland expansions. Sam? Sam looked up from his ledger, pushing aside a lock of hair that had fallen into his eyes. I've identified several tracts of land just beyond the Rosby Road. We can settle a portion of the refugees there. Give them basic tools, seeds, and a few months' provisions. The soil's decent. In time, they can grow crops to feed themselves and the city. Jon leaned forward. That's good. But we need a plan to protect them from bandits. Lord Royce and others keep reporting raids. If the refugees are scattered in farmland, they'll be easy prey. Ser Davos spoke in his gentle, gruff tone. We can spare a few men from the city watch to patrol, but it won't be enough. We might need to enlist local lords to support the effort. Promise them a share of the harvest if they provide guards. Now to Sir. Tyrion nodded. Yes, that might appeal to their sense of profit. We'll craft letters requesting their aid. If they refuse, we'll see what else can be done, but the watch is overstretched already. Jon agreed. Let's do that. The refugees can't farm in safety if they're threatened by outlaws at every turn. He paused, eyes flicking over to Arya. Speaking of outlaws, any update on the bandits near Rosby? Arya shrugged. I've heard rumors. They move in small groups, striking travelers and merchant wagons. No organized leadership that I know of. But if no one stops them, they'll grow bolder. And Jon turned to Davos. Send word to Rosby's Castellan. Have them coordinate patrols with our watch. If the bandits persist, we'll handle it directly. Davos inclined his head. Aye, my lord. Tyrion set his papers aside momentarily. There's also the matter of the coronation, which you agreed to hold in a fortnight. We need to finalize the arrangements. The High Septon is prepared to do the anointing in the remains of the Great Sept's courtyard. Lords and ladies from across the realm are receiving invitations as we speak. Nadstan. Jon's stomach twisted at the thought. The idea of standing before a crowd, reciting vows, and accepting a role he never truly wanted made him uneasy. Yet he knew it was necessary. Fine. Keep it simple. A short ceremony, minimal feasting. The realm can't afford extravagance. Tyrion's mouth quirked in a small smile. Just enough pomp to appease tradition then. He tapped a fresh parchment. One question remains. Who will stand at your side as you take your vow? Typically, the new ruler has the hand, and at least one representative of each major region. You also might want family present. Sansa, Arya, Bran. Jon glanced at Arya, who met his gaze with a mild shrug. I'll be there if you want me, she said simply. He nodded. I do. Bran, it's unclear if he'll come or if he'd prefer to remain in the north. Send an invitation. But I won't force him. He paused. As for Sansa, she's Lady of Winterfell. She should be invited too. I hope she'll come, but she may not. Her position is more secure in the north. Menschgani. Then Preto and Harful. Tyrion pursed his lips. Yes, well, we'll see. If she arrives, it will be an interesting day indeed. They went on to discuss more mundane details. How many guards to station, where to house visiting lords, how to maintain order in a city still struggling to feed its people. The conversation stretched for the better part of an hour, each item of business weaving into the next. By the time they finished, the morning sun shone fully through the tall windows, filling the chamber with a golden glow. At last Jon dismissed the council, urging them to continue their tasks. As they shuffled out, he lingered behind, resting his hands on the back of a chair. Ghost lay at his feet, gazing up with quiet devotion. A headache pulsed at Jon's temples, fueled by the endless swirl of obligations. He felt Arya's hand come to rest lightly on his shoulder. You'll get through it, she said. You have good people helping. He managed a small nod. I just hope it's enough. Go clear your head, she suggested. The city's not going to fall apart in an hour. Jon gave a faint snort, though he appreciated the attempt at humor. Maybe you're right, leaving Ghost behind for the moment. Knowing the direwolf would follow if he truly needed to, Jon made his way into the corridor, then down a set of steps that led to a battered balcony overlooking the bay. The tide was low, and he could see ships moored in the harbor, masts bobbing. The gulls wheeled overhead, their cries echoing off the scorched walls. Fragments of the old city still bore blackened scars, but some scaffolding rose here and there, a testament to the slow but certain rebuilding. He leaned on the railing, letting the sea breeze wash over him. A merchant ship unfurled its sails, preparing to depart. He wondered where it was headed. Perhaps to Pentos or Bravos, perhaps to the Arbor for wine. For a moment, he envied the sailors who would travel the open seas, free from the tangle of politics and the demands of a realm in disarray. But he knew that was a fleeting fantasy. His place was here, no matter how much he longed to be elsewhere. The breeze carried a hint of salt and distant fish markets. Closing his eyes, Jon found himself recalling Winterfell's crisp air, the scent of pine and cold earth. So much had changed since those days. The boy who stood on the walls of Winterfell, wishing for legitimacy or recognition, would hardly know the man Jon had become. Perhaps that was inevitable. He heard footsteps behind him. Turning, he saw Sam approaching with a hesitant smile. The wind ruffled Sam's hair, and he clutched a small book to his chest as though it might blow away. I was hoping to find you," Sam said, slightly out of breath. "Sorry to intrude." Jon waved off the apology. "You're not intruding. What is it?" Sam held out the slim volume. "I found something in the library. It's an account of how the city was rebuilt after one of the Targaryen kings razed large parts of it. Might be relevant to how we manage resources now. There are references to harvest planning, trade routes, even alliances formed for construction efforts." "There's a Morse tool." Jon took the book, flipping through a few pages. The script was neat, but archaic, peppered with notes on stone shipments, labor coordination, and water supply expansions. "Thank you, Sam. This could be useful." Sam's eyes shone with that scholar's enthusiasm Jon knew so well. "I just thought it might give us some ideas. We don't have dragons rebuilding the city, but we do have people who are willing to work if they're given direction and support. History doesn't repeat exactly, but it can guide us." "Then, Dick," Jon nodded. "Agreed. Anything that helps us avoid repeating mistakes is welcome." He paused, scanning the lines. "Can you summarize it for the council at the next meeting?" Sam's cheeks colored slightly. "Of course. I'll make notes on the key points." They stood in companionable silence for a moment, Sam glancing out at the harbor, Jon thumbing through pages, the sea breeze rifling them gently. "Eventually," Sam said, "Tyrion mentioned the coronation is set in a fortnight. Have you given any thought to your speech? You'll be expected to speak to the people, even if it's brief." Jon closed the book, feeling the weight of yet another task settle on him. "I haven't," he admitted. "I'm no orator. I'd rather just swear to protect them and be done with it." Sam's smile was understanding. "We can keep it simple, yes. But maybe you can say something about why the Iron Throne was melted down, about your intent to serve rather than rule with fear. Many might not fully understand your reasons. It could help them trust you." "Now," Jon sighed. "I'll think on it. Thank you, Sam." Sam nodded and took his leave, hurrying back inside with the book tucked under his arm. Jon watched him go, then returned his gaze to the harbor. The ship he'd seen had begun its journey, sails puffed out in the breeze. He felt a pang of longing for a simpler life. Yet he stayed, for duty, and for the memory of all those who had fought and died to give Westeros this chance at peace. By midday, the Red Keep's courtyard was alive with noise. Workers carried lumber, the clang of hammers echoed, and voices called orders back and forth. Jon found himself in the midst of it, reviewing sections of wall that needed reinforcing. An architect explained how they planned to replace weakened stones. Jon nodded at the technical details, trusting the man's expertise. He'd never claimed to be a master builder. Arya passed by at one point, a grin twitching her lips as she watched Jon struggle through explanations with the architect. He shot her a mock glare, then continued listening intently. After the architect departed, Arya joined Jon, both of them stepping aside to let a pair of laborers roll a heavy cart through the courtyard. "You look thrilled," she teased, eyeing the frown lines on his forehead. "Next, you'll be discussing mortar mixtures." He huffed a quiet laugh. "Don't joke. That was the next topic on his list." She smirked. "Rather you than me." They walked across the courtyard, the sun beating down more strongly now. Summer was waning, but the southern heat still clung. Arya hopped onto a short stone ledge and walked along it with practiced balance. Jon watched her, recalling the little girl who once tried to learn swordplay by mimicking the boys. She'd grown into a formidable fighter with a strange, wandering spirit. A messenger scurried up to Jon, face flushed. "My lord, there's a man from the Reach requesting an audience. Says he bears an urgent proposal about grain shipments." Jon exchanged a glance with Arya. She shrugged as if to say go on. He followed the messenger back into the keep, where they entered a small receiving room near the hall. Within stood a portly man dressed in green and gold finery. Lord Hightower's envoy, if John guessed right. The man bowed low. "My Lord Snow. I am Arnell, a steward from Old Town, sent by Lord Hightower. We heard about your need for grain and surplus. We have some to spare this season, thanks to fruitful harvests in the Lower Manor region. My lord wishes to negotiate a fair price, with the possibility of future trade arrangements." John felt a stirring of relief. The city desperately needed additional grain to feed the refugees. "That's welcome news. Please, sit. Shall we speak of terms?" Depsas. They spent half an hour talking, with Tyrion joining partway to advise on commerce. Arnell's terms were not entirely lenient. He wanted a guaranteed shipping lane protection and a lowered tariff for Hightower ships entering King's Landing. Tyrion deftly parried some of his demands, but in the end, they reached a tentative agreement that would bring much-needed grain into the city in exchange for certain trade benefits. John felt the tension in his shoulders ease slightly as he concluded the discussion. Another piece of stability, however small, had been secured. After Arnell departed, Tyrion remained behind, massaging his temples. "At least the Reach is open to helping. Without them, we'd be in dire straits. We still owe them a great debt for the war efforts." John nodded, thinking of the battles fought against the dead and later in the final conflict over the throne. So much blood spilled. Yes. If they remain allies, we might see the city recover faster than expected. Tyrion raised a cynical eyebrow. The Lords of the Reach will remain allies as long as they see profit or advantage, but that's how the game is played. Let's hope we continue to provide enough incentive. Nenaporotain. John offered a tired shrug. "I have no desire to cheat them. We need their cooperation, and I'm willing to pay a fair price." Tyrion gave a small, respectful bow. "That's precisely why I believe you might succeed where so many have failed. Honesty is a scarce commodity in these halls." They parted ways soon after, Tyrion heading off to prepare official documents for the agreement, John pausing in the hallway to stretch his stiff neck. Ghost brushed against his leg. He patted the direwolf's flank, grateful for the silent companionship. As the afternoon wore on, John found himself in the training yard. Not to spar, but to watch the City Watch recruits go through drills. The yard echoed with the clang of steel on steel. Men and a few women practiced strikes and parries under the watchful eye of an old knight, named Sir Adamar do Antiradamar. Their movements were earnest but clumsy in some cases. These were not seasoned soldiers. Many had been peasants or sellswords seeking steady pay. John wanted them trained to protect the realm, not terrorize it. He observed for a time, arms folded, occasionally stepping forward to correct a stance or demonstrate a better guard. Some recognized him and straightened, eyes wide. But he motioned for them to focus on the lesson. After a while, he felt a presence behind him. Arya again, moving like a wraith. "You should join them," John said, half teasing. "Show them how it's done." She smirked. "I'd likely scare them off. Besides, they need practice against each other, not me." "Napsarino." He chuckled softly, imagining the recruits trembling at the idea of facing Arya Stark, the girl who once slew the Night King's general with a single thrust of her blade. "Still, maybe a demonstration sometime. They could learn from your speed." She tipped her head in consideration. "Perhaps I will. Another day, when they're not half dead from these drills." They stood side by side, watching the recruits sweat in the hot sun, the yard's dust rising beneath their feet. John felt a twinge of nostalgia for his days with the Night's Watch, where training was tough, but camaraderie was forged in the cold of the north. Here, everything felt unsettled, transitional. Even the recruits' faces bore an uncertain tension, as though they weren't sure if this new order would last. By early evening, the shadows in the keep lengthened. John retreated to his chambers to wash off the dust and grime of the day. A basin of lukewarm water awaited him, along with a cloth. He splashed his face, letting the water drip from his beard. Ghost dozed in the corner, having followed him faithfully from the yard. When John emerged, wearing a clean tunic, he noticed a sealed letter left on the small table near the door. The wax bore the direwolf sigil of House Stark. His pulse quickened as he broke the seal and unfolded the parchment. The handwriting was Sansa's, neat and measured. She thanked him for the invitation, and stated that she would come to King's Landing for the coronation, arriving in roughly a week. She mentioned accompanying retainers and a small guard. The tone was polite but guarded, the final line reading, "May we find a way forward for the North and for the realm." Jon felt an odd mixture of relief and apprehension. He was glad she would be there. Her presence would reinforce the unity between North and South. Yet he knew they'd not parted under the easiest of terms. Her distrust of Daenerys, her wariness of Targaryen rule, even the question of Jon's parentage. Those wounds had never fully healed. Still, she was coming. That was something. He slipped the letter into a drawer, breathing out a slow sigh. Then he left his chambers, heading down the corridor toward the small hall where supper would be served. Along the way he spotted Sam, who carried an armful of scrolls, nearly bumping into a torch sconce as he hurried by. "Jon?" "Oh, sorry," Sam blurted, adjusting his grip. "I was just coming to find you." "Did you get the letter from Sansa?" Jon managed a faint smile. "Yes, I did. She'll be here in about a week." Sam's face brightened. "That's good news, I think. She's clever, resourceful. The city could benefit from her input." Jon nodded. "I just hope we can work together smoothly. The North has its own interests, and Sansa wants to protect them fiercely." "Nemeshro." Sam shifted, casting his gaze around to ensure no one was listening too closely. "Well, hopefully that protection aligns with the realm's needs. She knows better than most what happens when leadership fails. She won't want to see King's Landing destroyed again." Jon agreed, though he kept whatever deeper concerns he had to himself. "I'm heading to supper," he said. "Care to join me?" Sam looked longingly at the scrolls in his arms. "I need to finish cataloging these, but maybe I'll come by in a bit." "You go on." "No." Jon clapped him on the shoulder and continued down the corridor. The hall was already filling with courtiers and knights taking seats at a few trestle tables. There was more bustle than in previous weeks. New arrivals from across Westeros, likely responding to the approaching coronation. Some wore the sigils of the Reach, others from Dorne. Murmurs rose in multiple accents, a tapestry of the Seven Kingdoms converging under one roof. Jon took a place at a smaller table near the far end, preferring to avoid the center of attention. A servant brought him a bowl of stew, thick with vegetables, and a chunk of brown bread. The aroma made him realize how hungry he was. As he ate, he occasionally nodded a greeting to those who passed, though most gave him a respectful berth. Halfway through the meal, Tyrion approached with a goblet of wine in hand. He looked tired but not unfriendly. "May I?" he asked, gesturing to the bench opposite Jon. Jon waved for him to sit, swallowing a mouthful of stew. "Of course." Tyrion sank down, taking a sip of wine. "We have guests arriving sooner than expected. Word is traveling fast. Some want to be here well ahead of your coronation, possibly to speak with you privately about their own interests, no doubt." Jon grunted. "I'm not surprised. They'll want to negotiate deals before I'm officially bound by any ceremony." Tyrion's eyes gleamed with wry understanding. "Precisely. Lords can be cunning. They'll hope to secure your favor. Prepare for a parade of requests at all hours." Jon stabbed a piece of carrot. "Let them come. We'll handle them as best we can." Tyrion raised his goblet. "To your unending patience, then." He took a long drink. "By the way, there's a rumor that some of the Iron Islanders are still lurking in the harbor, likely waiting for Yara's arrival. I've seen a few rough-looking sorts in the corridors, definitely not from the mainland. Keep an eye on them. Keep an eye on them." Jon nodded. "I'll instruct the guards to remain vigilant. They're allowed to be here, but I don't want any trouble." The rest of the meal passed in subdued conversation, discussing the day's negotiations and the next steps for harbor repairs. When Jon finished his stew, he sat back, letting the warmth of the meal settle. The hall's fire crackled, casting flickering shadows on the stone walls. A moment of quiet reflection was all he dared allow himself. So many tasks awaited, so many concerns layered atop each other. As the crowd thinned, He left Tyrion to speak with a few minor lords who approached, leaving the hand to handle pleasantries and flatteries. Jon preferred to keep such social obligations short. He made his way to the corridor leading to the library, intending to spend a bit of time reviewing the old volume Sam had given him on historical rebuilding efforts. But the corridor was not empty. A figure stood there in plain clothes, though the posture and grace suggested someone used to courtly circles. By the torchlight, Jon recognized Gendry, the young Lord of Storm's End, though he often seemed uneasy with that title. Arya had once named him a bull-headed smith, and his calloused hands still bore the marks of the forge. "Jon," Gendry said, dipping his head. "I was just looking for you." Jon paused, noticing the tension in Gendry's stance. "What is it?" Gendry ran a hand over his short hair, exhaling. "I've come representing Storm's End as well as the new Baratheon line, I suppose. I've got news from the Stormlands. The lords there are petitioning for funding to rebuild their fleet. They claim they needed to defend the coast from pirates who've become bolder since the war." Jon rubbed his forehead. "Another request for coin we barely have." Gendry shrugged apologetically. "I know. But they're pressing me to bring it to you. They see me as you're linked to them. I've tried to explain our finances are strained. They want your assurance that the Stormlands won't be neglected under your rule." "Done?" Jon let out a breath, thinking of the grain deal, the harbor reconstruction, the farmland allocations. All the demands stacked up. They fought with us against the dead. They fought under Daenerys' banner for a time. I understand they want something in return, but there's only so much I can do at once." Gendry nodded. "I'll tell them we're working on it. Maybe we can strike a deal similar to what you did with the Reach. Some trade benefits or lower taxes if they use their own resources to rebuild part of the fleet. They have timber along the Stormlands coast, after all." Jon considered. "That might be a starting point. Tyrion can help draft terms. Thank you, Gendry." A hint of relief touched Gendry's face. "I'll speak with him. And if there's any work for me in the forge to help the city, let me know. I'm better at hammering steel than dealing with politics." Jon offered a wry smile. "I might take you up on that. The city needs every able smith it can get." They parted ways, and Jon continued toward the library. He found it nearly empty at this hour. A few candles flickered on the long tables, illuminating stacks of old tomes. Sam was there inevitably, but otherwise it was quiet. Jon let the hush envelop him as he selected the volume Sam had given him, sitting down at a table near a window. He turned pages slowly, reading about a time when King's Landing had been partly destroyed by dragonfire in the early Targaryen years. How the city was rebuilt through alliances with the Reach and the Westerlands. He traced the lines describing how farmland was expanded beyond the city walls to feed the influx of new settlers. It mirrored their current challenges in unsettling ways, a reminder that history often repeated itself. As he read, a distant memory stirred. Maester Aemon, back at Castle Black, recounting tales of Targaryen kings who rose and fell. Jon had never imagined he would one day rule, even in a partial sense, over what remained of that realm. A sense of humility washed over him, mingled with the weight of responsibility. After a time he closed the book, pinching the bridge of his nose. A glance out the window told him the hour was late. Stars pricked the night sky. Sam had left at some point without Jon noticing, likely to get at least a little sleep. Gathering the book under his arm, Jon left the library, stepping into corridors lit by sparse torches. Ghost joined him, trailing silently. The keep felt eerie at night, as though haunted by the ghosts of those who once walked these halls. Kings, queens, knights, and traitors. Jon passed a tapestry scorched by dragonfire, the edges frayed beyond repair. Another reminder of what had been lost. But perhaps they could build something better in its place. He reached his chamber, slipping inside. After setting the book on a small table, he sank onto the bed, the day's fatigue pressing down on him like lead. Ghost curled at his feet, and Jon rested his head against the headboard. His thoughts drifted to Sansa's letter. In a week, she'd be here, along with other lords and ladies from every corner of Westeros. The city would swell with their presence, tensions crackling like a storm about to break. He wished he could find solace in the notion that the coronation might unify them. But the scars ran deep, and not everyone believed in a new start without the Iron Throne. Some, he suspected, might resent him for dissolving that symbol of power. Others would test the boundaries of this new rule, seeking advantage where they could. In the flickering glow of the single candle, Jon removed his boots and loosened his tunic. The day's events swirled in his mind: grain deals, harbor repairs, farmland allocations, pleas from the Stormlands, the approach of Sansa, and the question of how they'd stand together or apart. The realm was like a fractured mirror, each shard reflecting a different struggle. He leaned back, trying to quiet his thoughts. A memory surfaced. The crypts of Winterfell, where he once stood before the statue of his father, or the man he'd believed was his father. So many truths had been upended. Yet the love he held for the family who raised him remained. Sansa, Bran, Arya. Whatever storms lay between them, he wanted to believe they could weather them together. A whisper of breeze stirred the curtains, letting in a breath of cool air from the night. Jon closed his eyes, listening to ghosts' slow breathing. Perhaps rest would come easier tonight. The city was far from whole, but they had small victories, a bit of grain, a measure of cooperation from the lords. And in a fortnight, he would stand before them all, anointed in the sight of the Seven, yet still a man who sought to do right by everyone, not to lord over them. Sleep stole over him in increments, like a tide creeping in over the sand. His final thought before darkness claimed him was that no matter what the morrow brought, be it negotiations, disputes, or the surprise arrival of old allies, he would face it. The Iron Throne was gone, but its shadow lingered. He intended to banish that shadow with each choice he made, forging a path of mercy and duty rather than conquest. In the silence of his chamber, with the candle guttering low, he let that resolve cradle him into a dreamless rest.